The first time Professor Vellix made his declaration, it echoed through the crystalline lecture chamber like a decree etched into stone. "No life form in the known galaxy," Vellix said, extending one long, translucent finger toward the towering hologram behind him, "can ascend Sky Mountain under its own power. The atmosphere becomes too thin past the cloud line, gravity distortion warps physical motion, and temperatures plummet to lethal extremes. It is a perfect natural deterrent. Climbing it is not just improbable. It is impossible." The hall of students, dozens of species, some levitating in nutrient pods, others slithering across the floor, remained silent. Except for one. "Are you sure about that?" The voice came from the back, filtered through a translator pinned to a coarse canvas jacket. The speaker stood up, adjusting the strap of a worn expedition pack. He was tall for his species, with sun-worn skin, dark eyes, and a face that looked like it had gone through more than a few bad ideas. "Who are you?" Vellix asked. "Jackson Herrera, Earth. I'm here on the Interplanetary Research Exchange." "Ah, human," Vellix said with a pause that suggested both curiosity and mild concern. "I've read up on Sky Mountain. No one's ever made it past the third plateau, right?" Jackson said, stepping closer to the hologram. "But it's not unclimbable." "You're just going at it the wrong way." Vellix blinked slowly as if processing the absurdity of the comment. "The wrong way? You think you can defy the physics of a planetary anomaly using what? Earth rope?" Jackson shrugged. "Something like that." The murmurs started immediately. A gelatinous being named Quirrell gurgled in disbelief. A group of avian scholars flapped their wings in derisive laughter. Vellix merely lowered the projection and tapped twice on the dais. "Then I challenge you, Jackson Herrera of Earth, attempt Sky Mountain, but do it with your own means. No flight, no teleportation, no orbital assistance. Climb it and prove me wrong." Jackson adjusted the strap on his shoulder again and grinned. "Deal." The base of Sky Mountain was a continent-wide fortress of glacial stone and jagged ridgelines. Winds tore through the crevices like freight trains. The lower plateaus were littered with failed camp remains, twisted thermal gear, cracked oxygen tanks, even the occasional collapsed tent still half buried in frost. Jackson stood at the base, staring up at the impossible wall of rock and cloud that extended beyond sight. A small, spherical drone hovered beside him. It had been assigned by the university for documentation. Its name was Varn. "You are now officially registered for the Sky Mountain Ascent trial," Varn said. "Please state your method of ascent." "Pulley system," Jackson said, unfolding a set of compact aluminum rods from his pack. There was a pause. "Please clarify." "You mean a primitive load-bearing rope and wheel mechanism?" "That's the one." "I must inform you this method has a failure rate of no need. I'm aware." He spent the first week just building. Anchoring into the rock was nearly impossible, but he scouted a narrow vertical chute that ran up the first 200 feet. Using a hand drill and carbon thread bolts, he set anchors every 10 feet, hoisting a small platform behind him. By the fourth day, his hands bled constantly. He wrapped them in synthetic gauze and kept going. Varn hovered, scanning silently. "Why not use a powered exosuit?" Varn asked one night as Jackson sterilized a gash in his forearm. "Too heavy. High-altitude systems fail in distorted gravity. I need something simple. Something that doesn't break when the air thins out. But the pulley system relies on stable anchor points. If the rock fractures, then I fall and die." "Yeah, I know." "Pass me the antiseptic." By the end of the 12th day, he had built the first vertical pulley segment, something like a freight elevator, but crude and manual. He rigged a counterweight from melted glacier water and scrap alloy, using a lever arm to hoist his platform up the chute. Every step required recalibration. Each section took days to test. It was slow, brutal, and entirely human. Back at the university, Vellix watched the live feed in silence. "He is not climbing," the professor said to his colleague, "a crustacean like being named Nert." "He is hoisting," Nert replied. "It is still ascent." "Technically," Nert conceded, "but still, he is not dead yet." Vellix narrowed his eyes. At the 6th plateau, the wind changed. Jackson's small camp was blown off the edge during the night. He lost half his water supply and barely managed to save the pulley crank system. He spent 2 days recovering from exposure, curled in a sleeping bag, shivering uncontrollably, his lips cracked and blackened. He rationed the last of his freeze-dried meals and melted snow for hydration. On the 3rd day, he tried to stand and collapsed. His legs refused to work for almost an hour. He lay there, staring at the sky, until a sharp pain in his side told him he had bruised a rib falling against the rock wall. When he could finally move again, he began rebuilding. By the time he reached the 9th plateau, he had been on the mountain for 44 days. His beard was thick and matted with frost. His right hand was nearly useless, 2 fingers infected from rope burns that hadn't healed cleanly. He had to cut away part of the glove to keep the fingers from swelling against the fabric. Oxygen at that height was barely 30% of sea level. He moved slower, rested more. Re-rigged the pulley system to use his body weight as the counterbalance, which meant securing a harness and flinging himself off the edge of each section to lift the equipment platform. Varn hovered silently now. It no longer questioned him. The final stretch was known as the glass face. A vertical sheet of rock, smooth as obsidian with no visible handholds, spanning nearly 300 feet to the summit ridge. Wind howled across it like a banshee. Jackson stared at it for 3 hours before he moved. He knew he couldn't drill into it. The surface would fracture. Instead, he built a free-hanging pulley tower, a kind of suspended scaffold anchored at the base and tensioned with climbing lines. It swayed in the wind like a metronome, and every time he climbed onto it, the entire structure creaked like it was about to rip loose. Twice it did. The second time, he fell 20 feet and cracked his ankle against the rock. He screamed for nearly 5 minutes, then passed out. When he woke, the ankle was swollen and tender. He couldn't put weight on it. He radioed the university medical unit. "I think I broke my ankle," he said, voice hoarse. "Remain still," came the reply. "We are dispatching a drone for mobile imaging." It arrived an hour later. The scan confirmed a non-displaced fracture in his right talus bone. "You will need immobilization and 3 to 6 weeks of recovery," the drone said. Jackson just stared at the summit. It was less than 300 feet away. "I don't have that long. You should not continue. I'll rig a seat harness. I can crank the pulley with my arms." He wrapped the ankle in a brace, secured it with tape, and built a new platform, half sitting, half harness. It took a week just to finish it. Every crank took 15 minutes. Each movement sent fire up his leg. He screamed into the wind more times than he could count. On the 72nd day, Jackson Herrera reached the summit of Sky Mountain. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't cheer. He collapsed. The last thing he remembered was Varn hovering above him, its lens flickering. "You have completed ascent." When he woke, he was in the university medical wing. His leg was in a cast. His fingers were wrapped and splinted. Fluid ives dripped into his arm. There was a leaden weight in his chest, but his lungs worked. Professor Vellix stood at the foot of the bed. "You climbed it," Vellix said quietly. "No," Jackson rasped. "I pulled myself up for a long time." Vellix said nothing. Then he sat down. "I revised the lecture," the professor said. "I now teach that Sky Mountain is not unclimbable. Only that no one had the right strategy before." Jackson gave a faint nod. Vellix reached into a pouch and placed a small silver medallion on the table, for ingenuity. Jackson stared at it. Then, slowly, he smiled. 3 weeks after the summit, Jackson still couldn't walk without crutches. His leg bore a titanium screw just above the ankle, and his right hand, still wrapped in a light compression brace, ached each morning like it had been caught in a vice overnight. The university's medtech team had offered neural pain dampeners. He declined the implants. "I'd rather know what's still broken," he said, adjusting the brace as Varn hovered nearby, recording. The medical wing was quiet that morning. Pale light filtered through the curved windows, casting a glow over the isolated recovery bay. Most patients at the university didn't stay more than a few days. Jackson had been there 22. "You are now cleared to begin assisted mobility training," Varn said, shifting slightly in the air. "Do you require a balance stabilizer?" Jackson stood slowly, gripping the rail beside his bed. "I'll take the wall," he said. "It doesn't beep every time I lean on it." He shuffled forward, dragging his left foot slightly to compensate for the other. Each step was deliberate. No part of it looked heroic. Professor Vellix arrived unannounced that afternoon, no entourage, no announcement, just a faint rustle of his long coat as he entered. His eyes, usually sharp with calculation, now flicked briefly toward Jackson's leg. "You were reviewed by over 70 planetary councils," Vellix said, stepping beside the window. "Some sent congratulations, others sent inquiries. One asked if you were a synthetic construct. That's flattering. They also requested a tissue sample." Jackson's brow furrowed. "I'm not mailing parts of myself to anyone. I told them you'd said that." There was a pause. Outside, a pair of insectoid students hovered across the courtyard, their wings casting flickering shadows on the glass. "I've been invited to speak at the Intergalactic Symposium of Applied Limits," Vellix said. "They want a discussion panel on redefining the term impossible. I've declined." "Why?" "I'm not interested in being quoted for something I was wrong about." Jackson leaned against the wall. "You weren't wrong. You just underestimated how stubborn we get when someone says we can't do something." Vellix crossed his arms. "That wasn't stubbornness. That was something else." Jackson didn't answer. He was focused on moving to the chair without collapsing. It took nearly a full minute. When he finally sat, he exhaled slowly. Vellix remained standing. "There's a theory," the professor said, "that the human response to adversity is not rooted in intelligence or strength, but in something called cognitive defiance. The refusal to accept an observed limitation as absolute." Jackson adjusted his leg carefully. "Sounds like a fancy way of saying we're built to ignore good advice. I've studied thousands of species. Most adapt by avoiding risk. You seem to adapt by charging straight into it and figuring it out while bleeding." Jackson gave a half nod and glanced at Varn. "You've been quiet." "I am recalculating statistical models," the drone said. "Your ascent invalidated 412 predictive scenarios." Vellix turned toward the drone. "Delete the models, build new ones. That would take over a decade. Then start now." Later that evening, Jackson was wheeled into the atmospheric lab for a briefing. The room was mostly empty except for a tall, moss-colored alien with a dozen eyes and a clipboard-like device mounted to its forearm. It introduced itself as Drarx, the atmospheric biophysics coordinator. "We are replicating upper altitude conditions from Sky Mountain," Drarx said. "Pressure, oxygen content, thermal gradation, and gravity shear. We want to understand how your body functioned under those stresses." "I barely did," Jackson said. "You sure you want to reproduce that?" Drarx emitted a low purring sound, which the translator did not interpret. "We have not encountered a carbon-based being able to sustain consciousness at those altitudes unaided. Your neurological scans show active problem-solving during periods of hypoxia. I had to retie a pulley with one hand while hallucinating that the sky was melting." "That count? It is data." They strapped him into a variable pressure chamber and gradually lowered the oxygen saturation. Jackson watched the walls pulse slightly as the pressure shifted. He started feeling light-headed after 5 minutes. "Can we not do the part where I pass out this time?" he muttered. Drarx tapped the panel. "We will terminate the simulation at pre-syncope levels. You may experience short-term disorientation." Sounds familiar. Afterward, they gave him a glucose pack and wheeled him back to the main wing. Varn followed, humming faintly. "Your pulmonary efficiency increased by 7% compared to baseline scans from 1 month ago," the drone said. "You are adapting. That's how it works. Your body figures it out while you're trying not to die. You should not have survived." "Yet you did." Jackson closed his eyes. "That's not the compliment you think it is." The next day, a delegation from the Council of Interplanetary Physiology arrived. They wore matching robes and floated 3 inches off the floor. The shortest among them, a lavender-skinned being with no visible mouth, spoke first. "We are here to observe the Earth specimen." "I'm a guy with a busted ankle, not a specimen," Jackson said, already regretting agreeing to the visit. "You ascended an unscalable mountain using rudimentary tools. That qualifies you for specimen status." "That's not how I'd word it." The delegation circled him, scanning his limbs, measuring his lung capacity, and murmuring in a language that sounded like wind through metal pipes. One of them tapped the cast on his leg and turned to Varn. Did the human reattach the limb himself? No, Varn replied. It was set by medical professionals. The alien tilted its head. Then how did he continue climbing? He used a pulley system and upper body strength. There was a pause. That is inadvisable. Jackson stared at the ceiling. Glad we're all caught up. 2 days later, he was cleared for aquatic therapy. The university pool was engineered for beings of varying densities and configurations. One section was zero gravity. Another was heated to accommodate cold-blooded species. Jackson was assigned a middle lane with moderate resistance currents. He lowered himself into the water carefully, guided by a gelatinous assistant named Ern. It smelled faintly of moss and static electricity. You must not push off with the injured limb, Ern said, adjusting the buoyancy pads on his torso. Begin with rotational stretches only. Jackson floated on his back, letting the water numb the ache in his side. He moved his arms slowly, tracing arcs above his head. You are still in pain, Ern observed. Yeah, but it's quieter in here. Pain is useful. It tells you what not to repeat. Funny. I thought that's what lectures were for. Ern blinked 3 times, which Jackson took as amused agreement. By the end of the session, his legs trembled from the effort of just staying upright in the water. But he hadn't collapsed. That night, he sat in the courtyard by the thermal lamps, wrapped in a blanket that smelled vaguely of ozone. Vellix joined him again, this time without speaking for several minutes. I thought you'd be eager to return to Earth, the professor said eventually. They'll want interviews, book deals. Maybe a movie. You do not want that. I didn't do it for that. Then why? Jackson didn't answer immediately. He watched the 2 moons drift apart across the sky. I wanted to see if it could be done. That's it. Vellix tilted his head. You risked permanent damage for a question. Some questions are worth that. The professor looked back toward the mountain, barely visible in the distance, its peak still shrouded in dusk-lit clouds. I don't think your species should be underestimated any longer. Jackson gave a tired grin. Give it a few years. We'll find a new way to freak everyone out. Vellix didn't argue. They sat in silence after that, both watching the stars blink into view. Neither of them said it, but they both understood. What had happened wasn't just an event. It was a shift. A recalibration of what was thought possible. And somewhere, someone would now be asking a new question. What next? Jackson grunted as he lowered himself into the neuromuscular stim chair, the cold of the contact pads biting through the thin cloth of his shirt. The technician, a tall plant-based being with fibrous skin and eyes like polished amber, pressed a small control fob and the machine hummed to life. Jackson's legs twitched involuntarily. Intensity level, the technician asked, adjusting a dial with one vine-like appendage. Start low. My calf still feels like it's been beaten with a frozen pipe. Level 3 it is. Signal duration, 15 seconds per cycle. Jackson nodded, already bracing. The first pulse hit like a cramp that didn't quite know where to settle. He clenched his jaw. Your muscle fibers show dense micro-tearing, the technician said, scanning a panel. We will need at least 4 sessions to restore full range of motion. Great. I was hoping for something mildly excruciating. The technician blinked once, unamused, then stepped back. Rest between cycles. Overexertion will interfere with regrowth. Jackson exhaled slowly and focused on the wall across from him, where a mural of interstellar explorers had been etched into the glass. Most of them floated with dignified grace, adorned in sleek suits and bioluminescent gear. None were hauling a pulley system or wearing bandaged fingers. By the 3rd cycle, sweat had gathered at the base of his neck. His right thigh quivered under the strain. He leaned back and bit down on the inner fabric of his collar. The door hissed open. You're not screaming. That's a good sign, Vellix said, stepping inside without waiting for acknowledgement. Come back in 10 minutes, Jackson muttered. Might be more theatrical. I brought someone. A second figure entered, smaller, with a smooth, angular frame and wide, expressionless eyes. Its skin was soft blue, almost translucent near the joints. This is Keth, Vellix said. From the Academy of Adaptive Mechanics, they have a theory. Keth bowed slightly. We believe the pulley system you designed may have applications in low-energy vertical transit for microgravity environments. We've never seen a load transfer system with such minimal component reliance. Jackson stopped the stim unit manually and wiped his forehead. You want to use it for space elevators. We'd like to test its scalability. You used no motors, yet achieved a lift ratio that remained stable over 70 meters of vertical gain per segment. That is unexpected. It's not a new design, just old ideas used differently. Keth didn't blink. That is precisely why it's valuable. Vellix stepped closer, arms folded. They'd like you to consult. Jackson shook his head slowly. I'm not climbing anything else, not for a while. No climbing, just analysis, Keth said. Your injury reports are public. We understand the limitations. He glanced down at his leg, still wrapped in a compression sleeve. You'll have to give me time. I move slower than a rockslide right now. We are patient. After the two left, the technician resumed the stim cycles. Jackson endured 3 more rounds before signaling for the session to end. His leg trembled as he stood. 2 days later, he entered the applied mechanics lab, aided only by a cane with a shock-absorbing base. The room was filled with layered platforms and segmented scaffolds made from translucent alloys. At the center stood a scaled model of his Pulley tower, rendered in fine detail using a polymer resin. Keth was there, along with 2 more researchers whose names he didn't catch the first time. They communicated in brief clicks, but one looked up and gestured toward the model. We reconstructed your final ascent rig, Keth said, but we cannot determine how you stabilized the base tension under shifting wind load. Jackson stepped closer, peering at the lower struts. I buried the ground anchor, used melted ice to refreeze around it. When it hardened, it held better than bolts. Keth looked stunned. You used ice as a structural fastener. It was the only thing that wouldn't crack the rock face. One of the researchers turned and scribbled something into a floating notepad. Keth circled the model slowly. Your species' ability to improvise under physical duress is not well documented. Most beings abandon attempts at this stage of environmental hostility. Jackson leaned against the table. We don't always make smart choices. But we usually make something work. The next few hours were spent examining each segment of the rig in detail. He explained how he used tension redistribution to stop the rig from swaying, why he chose a single line haul over a double line, and how he modified the braking system using a bent alloy plate and friction wrap. By the time the sun dipped below the lab's high windows, Keth had recorded over 3 hours of data. As Jackson left, he passed a group of students watching an animation of the climb on a suspended screen. The rendering showed his figure inching upward, the pulley wheel turning slowly, ropes taut. Someone muttered something in a language the translator didn't catch. The others nodded, silent. Outside, clouds drifted low across the sky. His ankle throbbed faintly with each step. He didn't mind it. 3 days later, he was cleared to walk unaided. The medtechs gave him a list of precautions, exercises, and a set of elastic bands for strengthening. He did all of it, even the boring parts. One morning, he managed to jog for 10 seconds before the pain flared again. He stopped, breathed, and waited. Then he tried 12. By the end of the week, he could climb a single flight of stairs without holding the rail. He found Varn waiting on the balcony one afternoon, its lens focused on the distant silhouette of Sky Mountain. You are no longer under observation, the drone said. My role has concluded. You're leaving. My data set is complete, but I have requested reassignment to Earth. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Why? I wish to understand what environmental stressors create such adaptive responses. Your planet appears to specialize in difficulty. Jackson laughed once, short and dry. It's a good teacher. I will recommend a study on human resilience. Make sure they spell my name right. The next day, the university held a small gathering in the central forum. Not a ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement. No speeches, no banners. Just Vellix, Keth, and a few others who had followed the climb's aftermath with growing astonishment. Keth presented a scaled-down replica of the Pulley rig, now modified with a kinetic capacitor for use in orbital climbs. It was labeled simply, Heron Variant. Jackson took it in his hands, turning it slowly. I didn't invent anything, he said. You didn't need to, Keth replied. He nodded once and stepped back into the crowd, Later that evening, he returned to the courtyard by the lamps. The air was warmer than usual, the breeze calm. His cane lay forgotten beside the bench. Vellix sat beside him without a word. They watched the stars appear, one by one. "I submitted a revision to the Sky Mountain Data Archive," Vellix said eventually. "No more impossible label, now it reads, previously unscaled due to inadequate creativity." Jackson grinned. "That's closer." They sat in silence for a while. When Jackson stood to leave, he didn't limp. Vellix didn't comment. As he walked away, the wind rose slightly, tugging at the hem of his jacket. He didn't look back.